The night my son called me a nobody was the same night the truth found me. I stood in the corner of Daniel's glittering charity gala, Muff Daniel's glittering charity gala, MY hands trembling around a glass of water I couldn't drink. When someone asked who I was, he didn't hesitate. "She's just my mother," he said flatly. She didn't build anything. My hands trembling around a glass of water I couldn't drink. When someone asked who I was, he didn't hesitate. "She's just my mother," he said flatly. She didn't build anything. The room fell silent. I felt myself shrinking until a voice cut through the air. "Helen Crawford!" A TV reporter stepped forward, eyes wide with recognition. "We've been looking for you for years." And just like that, everything changed. If this story touches something in your heart, take a moment to like and subscribe. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and tell me. Have you ever been judged by someone who didn't know your true story? I live in a small, quiet house on the edge of a modest neighborhood in New Jersey. It's the kind of place people pass without noticing. White paint slightly faded, a porch swing that creaks in the wind, and flower pots I've been tending for years. There's nothing remarkable about it. Nothing that would suggest I once stood in a room filled with millionaires or that I would be the subject of whispered conversations by the end of that night. Most mornings, I wake up before the sun rises. I make myself a cup of coffee, sit by the kitchen window, and watch the world slowly come to life. It's peaceful, simple, predictable. And for a long time, I told myself that was enough. But there's a silence in my home that no routine can fill. It's the silence of a phone that rarely rings. The silence of a son who used to call me every Sunday and now barely calls at all. Daniel Crawford, my only child. If you were to look him up, you'd find articles describing him as a self-made tech visionary. His face has been on magazine covers. His company, Crawford Innovations, has offices in New York, San Francisco, even overseas. He lives in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, surrounded by glass walls and city lights that never go out. I remember the first time I visited that apartment. I stood near the entrance, afraid to touch anything. Everything was sleek, polished, expensive. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a statement. And I didn't belong in it. Emily opened the door that day. My daughter-in-law. She was beautiful in the kind of way magazines like perfect hair, perfect posture, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked me up and down in a single glance, taking in my worn coat and practical shoes. "Oh, Helen," she said, like she had almost forgotten my name. No hug, no warmth, just polite distance. Daniel greeted me shortly after, but even his hug felt different. Lighter, brief, like something done out of obligation rather than affection. "Mom, you didn't have to come all this way," he said, already glancing at his phone. "I wanted to see you," I replied, trying to smile. "I'm just really busy these days." Busy. That word became a wall between us. At first, I didn't question it. I told myself it was normal. He was building something important. He had responsibilities, a life of his own. But visits became shorter. Phone calls became rare. And when we did speak, it felt like I was interrupting something more important. I remember one particular dinner that stayed with me. Emily had invited a few of their friends over, people who spoke about investments, properties, and vacations in places I had only seen on television. I sat quietly at the table, listening, smiling, when it seemed appropriate. At one point, someone asked me, "So Helen, what do you do?" It was a simple question, but before I could answer, Emily jumped in. "Oh, she's retired," she said quickly. "She enjoys her little community work." Little. I nodded, pretending not to notice the way she said it. Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't even look at me. That night, I went back to my small house, feeling like a guest, in my own son's life. After that, I started visiting less. Not because I didn't want to see him, but because I wasn't sure he wanted to see me. Instead, I kept myself busy. There's a shelter about 20 minutes from my house. It's nothing fancy, just a converted building with peeling paint and overworked staff. But it's full of people who have nowhere else to go. I started volunteering there years ago. At first, it was just a way to fill my time, but over the years, it became something more. I help serve meals. I organize donated clothes. Sometimes I just sit and listen to people's stories of loss, of mistakes, of bad luck and broken systems, people who have been forgotten. In a strange way, I feel more seen there than I do anywhere else. No one cares what I wear. No one asks how much money I have. They just care that I show up. And I do. Every week, sometimes more. Daniel knows about the shelter, of course. Or at least he used to. The last time it came up in conversation, he sighed. "Mom, you're still doing that?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "It matters to me." He shook his head slightly. "You should be enjoying your life. Traveling, relaxing, not spending all your time with people who—" He stopped himself. With people who— What I asked gently. He didn't answer directly. "I just don't get it," he said. "You've spent your whole life struggling. Why would you choose to stay in that world? That world, as if it were something separate from him now, as if he hadn't come from it." I didn't argue. I never do. I guess I said quietly, "Some things are hard to understand unless you've lived them." He didn't respond, and that was the end of the conversation. After that, we spoke even less. Months would pass without a visit. Sometimes I would see him on television before I heard from him personally. Interviews, speeches, awards. He always spoke with such confidence, such certainty, about success, about hard work, about building something from nothing. And every time I felt a strange mix of pride and distance. Because while I was proud of the man he had become, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, he had rewritten the story of how he got there. The gala invitation arrived unexpectedly, a thick envelope embossed with gold lettering. Crawford Innovations Annual Charity Gala. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a formal invitation along with a short handwritten note from Daniel. "Mom, it would mean a lot if you came." It was the first time in months that he had reached out. My heart lifted just a little. Maybe things were changing. Maybe he missed me. Maybe this was his way of reaching back. I chose my best dress, simple but elegant. I even went to a salon to have my hair done. It felt strange looking at myself in the mirror, trying to see what others might see. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. But when I arrived at the gala, I realized very quickly I had misunderstood everything. There was a time when Daniel didn't look at me with distance in his eyes. There was a time when I was his whole world. I don't think people truly understand what it means to be a single mother until they've lived it. It's not just about raising a child. It's about becoming everything at once. Provider, protector, teacher, comfort, and sometimes the only person standing between your child and a world that doesn't care whether they make it or not. Daniel was 5 years old when his father left. No warning, no explanation, just a suitcase by the door and a silence that settled into our home like a permanent guest. I remember kneeling in front of Daniel that night, trying to find the right words. "He loves you," I told him, even though I wasn't sure if it was true. "Then why did he go?" Daniel asked, his small voice breaking in a way no child's voice ever should. I didn't have an answer. So I did the only thing I could. I stayed. From that moment on, everything I did was for him. I worked at a diner during the day. The kind of place where the coffee is always too strong and the customer's always in a hurry. I wore the same uniform every shift, smiling through exhaustion, memorizing orders, pretending my feet didn't ache by the end of it. At night, I cleaned office buildings downtown. Rows of empty desks. Cold fluorescent lights. The hum of machines that never truly shut off. I would push my cart from floor to floor, wiping surfaces that belonged to people who probably made more in a day than I did in a month. Sometimes I would pause and look out the windows at the city lights, and I would whisper to myself, "One day, Daniel will belong in a place like this, but not like me. Not cleaning, leading, building, becoming something more." There were nights I came home so tired I could barely stand, but Daniel would be asleep in his small bed, clutching his worn-out stuffed bear, and I would sit beside him for a moment, just watching him breathe. That was enough to keep me going. There were sacrifices I never talked about, times I skipped meals so there would be enough food for him. Winters when I told him I wasn't cold, even though my coat was too thin, and the wind cut straight through it. Birthdays where I smiled brightly while giving him gifts I had saved months to afford. I never wanted him to feel what I felt growing up. Lack, fear, uncertainty. I wanted him to believe the world was open to him, and he did. Daniel was always bright, curious, determined. Teachers noticed him early on. "He has something special," one of them told me during a parent-teacher conference. I held on to those words like they were a promise. When he got into a good college, I cried in the kitchen after he left the room. Not because I was sad, but because I knew I had done it. I had gotten him there. I remember the day of his college graduation like it was yesterday. The campus was filled with families, well-dressed parents, proud smiles, cameras flashing. I stood near the back wearing my best dress, which still wasn't quite like the others. For a moment, I hesitated. I looked at the crowd, at the polished shoes and tailored suits, and I felt that familiar feeling creeping in that I didn't belong, that I was out of place. But then I saw him. Daniel. Standing tall in his cap and gown, scanning the crowd. Looking for me. When our eyes met, his face lit up. "Mom," he called, waving like he was still a little boy. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not what I wore, not where I stood, not who was watching. I walked toward him, and when he hugged me, it was tight, real, full of everything we had been through together. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. I believed him. I truly did. After graduation, things started to change, but slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Daniel got a job in the city, then a better one, then another opportunity that led to something bigger. His world expanded quickly, filled with new people, new ideas, new ambitions. At first, he still called regularly. He would tell me about his projects, his coworkers, his plans. "I'm going to build something, Mom," he said once. "Something that matters." "You already have," I replied. But over time, those calls became shorter, then less frequent, then occasional. The more successful he became, the less he seemed to look back. And I understood it, in a way. Success changes people. Not always in bad ways, but in ways that create distance. New environments, new expectations, new identities. Sometimes old parts of your life don't seem to fit anymore. I just never thought I would become one of those parts. The first time I felt it clearly was during one of his early company events. He had invited me, and I was so proud I almost couldn't sleep the night before. I picked out a simple dress, did my best with my hair, and took the train into the city. The venue was modern, bright, full of people who spoke confidently about things I didn't fully understand. Daniel introduced me to a few colleagues. "This is my mom," he said. There was a pause, polite smiles, quick nods, and then the conversation moved on without me. I stood there, holding a drink I didn't want, listening to people talk around me as if I were invisible. That night, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. Daniel wasn't ashamed of me, not exactly, but I didn't fit into the world he was building. And instead of trying to bring me into it, he had quietly started to leave me behind. I didn't confront him. I didn't want to be a burden, so I stepped back. Let him grow. Let him shine, and told myself that this was the price of success. But I never imagined that one day he wouldn't just leave me behind quietly. He would push me away in front of the entire world. The gala was nothing like anything I had ever experienced before. It was held in a grand ballroom in Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, soft golden lighting reflecting off polished marble floors, and tables dressed in white linen so pristine they looked untouched by the world. Everything shimmered. Everything whispered wealth. And as I stepped inside, I felt it immediately, that quiet, familiar sensation of being out of place. I clutched my small purse a little tighter, adjusting the sleeve of my dress as I walked forward. It was the nicest thing I owned, carefully pressed, chosen with hope. But among designer gowns and tailored suits, it felt simple, invisible. No one stopped me. No one greeted me. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, smiling politely when someone's eyes briefly met mine before drifting away again. For a moment, I wondered if Daniel had truly meant it when he said it would mean a lot for me to come, or if I had misunderstood that too. Then I saw him. Daniel stood near the center of the room, surrounded by people. He looked exactly like the man I saw in magazines. Confident, composed, dressed in a perfectly fitted black tuxedo. His posture was straight, his voice steady as he spoke, his laughter easy. He belonged here. Completely. For a second, I just stood there and watched him. Not the CEO, not the public figure, but the little boy who used to run into my arms after school, his backpack bouncing behind him, his face full of excitement as he told me about his day. I took a breath and started walking toward him. When he finally noticed me, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Maybe. Or discomfort. "Mom," he said, stepping slightly away from the group. "You made it." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied softly. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to feel. "You look nice," he added, almost as an afterthought. "Thank you." He glanced back at the people behind him. "I'm in the middle of something. Just make yourself comfortable, okay? I'll come find you later." Before I could respond, he turned back to his conversation. And just like that, I was standing alone again. I nodded, even though he wasn't looking. "Of course," I whispered. I spent the next hour moving from one side of the room to the other, trying to look like I belonged somewhere. I picked up a glass of water from a passing tray, just to have something in my hands. People talked around me about investments, partnerships, expansion plans. Words that felt distant, like a language I could hear, but not fully understand. At one point, I found myself near a group of women discussing a charity project. "Oh, we raised over $1 million last year," one of them said proudly. "That's incredible," another replied. "It's so important to give back." I almost smiled at that. Giving back. If only they knew. But I stayed quiet, because I had learned something over the years. Sometimes people don't really want to hear your story. They just want to hear something that fits into theirs. Eventually, I found a seat at the edge of the room. From there, I could see everything. The stage, the crowd, Daniel. He moved effortlessly between conversations, shaking hands, smiling, commanding attention without even trying. I should have felt proud, and I did. But there was something else too, a quiet ache. Because the closer I watched him, the more I realized how far away he had become. At some point, the lights dimmed slightly, and the event began. A host took the stage, welcoming everyone, speaking about the company's achievements, its impact, its commitment to the community. Then Daniel was invited up. The applause was immediate, loud, admiring. I joined in clapping softly, my eyes fixed on him as he walked onto the stage. "Thank you," he began, his voice clear and confident. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating success. It's about recognizing the journey it takes to get here." I leaned forward slightly, listening. "This company started with nothing but an idea and a willingness to work harder than anyone else," he continued. "I built it from the ground up. Every late night, every risk, every sacrifice, it all came from a belief that if you want something bad enough, you make it happen." The audience nodded, murmuring in agreement. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the table. "I didn't come from privilege," Daniel went on. "No one handed me anything. Everything I have today, I earned myself." Something inside me shifted, just slightly. Not anger, not yet. Just something unsettled. I told myself not to read too much into it. Maybe he was just speaking in broad terms. Maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But then someone from the audience called out a question. "What about your family?" a man asked with a smile. "Did they support you along the way?" Daniel hesitated, just for a second. Then he smiled. "My mother is here tonight," he said, scanning the room briefly before his eyes landed on me. "She did her best." There was a polite ripple of laughter. My chest tightened. Did her best. The words echoed in my mind louder than they should have. Someone else spoke up. "What did she do?" a woman asked, genuinely curious. "And that's when it happened." Daniel let out a small, dismissive breath. "She worked small jobs," he said. "Nothing that really shaped what I built. I had to figure most of it out on my own." The room didn't react dramatically. No gasps, no shock, just a quiet acceptance. Because to them, it was just a detail. But to me, it was everything. I felt the heat rise in my face, my hands beginning to tremble. The noise in the room faded, replaced by a dull ringing in my ears. Small jobs, nothing that mattered. I lowered my eyes, staring at the tablecloth in front of me, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't the little boy who once held my hand so tightly he wouldn't let go. This was someone else, someone who had rewritten his past in a way that no longer included me. And I sat there silent, because I had always believed that love meant stepping back when you weren't wanted, that dignity meant not making a scene, that strength meant enduring. So I stayed quiet, even as something inside me quietly broke. But what I didn't know in that moment was that someone in that room had been listening very carefully. And unlike me, they weren't going to stay silent. I don't remember how long I sat there after Daniel finished speaking. The applause came first, polite, controlled, respectful. The kind of applause reserved for someone who had said exactly what people expected to hear. It filled the room, echoing against the high ceilings, wrapping around me like a distant storm. But for me, everything felt muted, like I was underwater. I kept my eyes down, my fingers still gripping the edge of the table, as if letting go might make me fall apart completely. I told myself to breathe, to stay composed, to not let anyone see, because that's what I had always done. I had spent my entire life holding things together quietly. But then something unexpected happened. A voice. Clear, firm, unapologetic. "Excuse me, can I ask something?" The room shifted slightly. Conversations paused. Heads turned. I looked up. A woman stood near one of the side aisles holding a microphone. She was in her early 40s, maybe dressed professionally, but not extravagantly. There was something about her, something grounded, observant. She wasn't like the others. "I'm Laura Mitchell," she said, addressing the stage. "I'm with Channel 8 News." A ripple moved through the crowd. "A reporter." Daniel smiled politely, adjusting his posture. "Of course," he said. "Go ahead." Laura tilted her head, slightly studying him. "You mentioned building everything on your own," she said. "No real support system. No significant influence from your background." Daniel nodded. "That's right." She paused, just long enough for the room to feel it. "Then, I'm curious," she continued, "how you explain certain records connected to your early funding and educational support." The atmosphere changed, subtly, but unmistakably. Daniel's smile tightened just a fraction. "I'm not sure what you mean," he replied. Laura didn't hesitate. "I mean the Crawford Community Trust," she said. "The one that paid for your first 2 years of tuition. The one that also provided seed funding for your initial startup proposal." A quiet murmur spread through the audience. I felt my heart skip. Crawford Community Trust. I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in years. Daniel blinked. "That was a small local fund," he said quickly. "Nothing significant." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Small," she repeated. "The records show over $200,000 allocated over a 5-year period." Now the murmurs grew louder. Daniel shifted slightly, his confidence wavering for the first time. "That's being exaggerated," he said. "Those were general community resources, not personal support." I felt a strange sensation building in my chest. Not quite hope, not quite fear, something in between. Laura took a step forward. "And the founder of that trust?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "It was a community initiative," he said, avoiding the question. Laura's gaze didn't waver. "No," she said calmly. "It wasn't." The room fell into a deeper silence. "The Crawford Community Trust was established 15 years ago by a single individual," she continued. "A woman who used her own earnings primarily from service and contract work to create a fund for underprivileged students and small business startups." My breath caught. I could feel eyes beginning to shift around the room. Not yet toward me, but searching, connecting pieces. Daniel's voice was sharper now. "I think this is getting off topic," he said. "Tonight is about the company's achievements." "I agree," Laura interrupted gently. "Which is why context matters." She turned slightly, scanning the room. "And context," she said, "includes acknowledging the people who made those achievements possible." Something inside me trembled. I didn't move. I couldn't. Laura's eyes moved again. "And then they found me." For a moment, everything froze. The lights, the voices, the space between breaths. Then she spoke. "Helen Crawford," she said. My name, out loud, in a room full of strangers. Dozens of heads turned toward me instantly. I felt the heat rise in my face again, but this time it wasn't shame. It was something else. Exposure. Daniel's head snapped in my direction, his expression shocked confusion, something almost like panic. Laura continued. "The founder of the Crawford Community Trust is here tonight," she said, sitting quietly as she has for years. The murmurs became whispers. Whispers became attention, and attention became something heavier. Expectation. I wanted to disappear, to shrink back into the shadows, to return to the place where I was invisible and safe. But something held me there. Maybe it was the years, the sacrifices, the silence I had carried for so long. Or maybe it was the realization that this moment had nothing to do with pride. It had to do with truth. Laura's voice softened slightly. "Helen," she said, not as a reporter now, but as someone speaking directly to another human being. "Would you be willing to stand?" My hands trembled as I placed them on the table. For a second, I thought I might not be able to do it, that my body would refuse, that I would remain seated hidden as I always had been. But then I thought of Daniel. Not the man on the stage. The boy. The one who once said I couldn't have done this without you. And slowly I stood. The room shifted again. But this time it wasn't just curiosity. It was recognition. People looked at me differently now, not with dismissal, not with polite indifference, but with something closer to realization. Daniel stared at me, his face pale. "Mom," he said, barely audible. Laura continued, her voice steady. "Helen Crawford has spent decades funding education, housing support, and small business opportunities for people in her community," she said, often anonymously, often without recognition. My throat tightened. I hadn't wanted this, any of it, not the attention, not the spotlight. But it was happening, and I couldn't stop it. The trust that supported Daniel Crawford, Laura added, was not a random resource. It was created specifically to ensure he and others like him would never face the same barriers his mother did. A silence fell over the room that felt heavier than anything before. Because now everyone understood. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him. And for the first time in years, he looked like that little boy again. Not confident, not untouchable, just lost. And suddenly I realized something. This moment wasn't about exposing him. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about something much deeper, something neither of us had faced in a long time. The truth of where we came from, and the cost of forgetting it. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room resting on me, not glancing, not passing over politely, but fixed, curious, searching, measuring. It was a kind of attention I had never wanted. For years, I had done everything quietly, carefully, intentionally unseen. I believed that if you did good work, truly meaningful work, it didn't need an audience. It didn't need applause. It only needed purpose. And now, standing in that ballroom, I felt exposed in a way that made my chest tighten. I wanted to sit back down, to disappear again. But Laura's voice held steady, guiding the moment forward. "Helen," she said gently, "would you be willing to share a little about the trust? About why you started it?" I swallowed. My throat felt dry. I hadn't spoken in front of a crowd like this ever, and certainly not about something so personal. I didn't expect I began my voice softer than I intended. A microphone appeared beside me, so Miwon, from the event staff, offering it with a polite, practiced smile. I hesitated. Then I took it. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. I didn't start it for recognition. I said, my voice trembling slightly before I steadied it. I started it because I knew what it felt like. To have no one. The room grew quieter. Even the small movements, the shifting of chairs, the soft clinking of glasses, seemed to fade. I grew up with very little. I continued. And when my son was young, there were moments when I didn't know how I was going to make things work. But I made a promise to myself. I paused, taking a breath. That if I ever got to a place where I could help someone else not feel that way, I would. There was a stillness now. Not the polite kind, the listening kind. I didn't have much, I said. But over time, small things add up. Extra shifts, careful savings, saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to things that mattered more. I glanced down briefly, then back up. And eventually, I realized it wasn't just about my son anymore. That was the truth I had never fully said out loud before. Daniel wasn't the only child who needed help. I continued. There were others, kids with potential, families doing their best, people who just needed one opportunity. My hands steadied as I spoke, because this part was real. I didn't want them to feel like the door was closed before they even got a chance to knock. I said. A silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. I didn't realize I had started crying until I felt the tear reach my chin. I quickly wiped it away. I'm sorry, I said softly. You don't need to apologize, Laura replied from across the room. I looked up. She wasn't smiling for the camera. She wasn't performing. She was present. Can I ask you something else? She said. I nodded slowly. Why did you never tell your story? She asked. Why stay anonymous all these years? I hesitated. That question lingered longer than the others. Because the answer wasn't simple. I didn't think it mattered, I said finally. A few people shifted slightly as if that answer surprised them. I believed the work mattered. I continued, not the person behind it. I didn't want anyone to feel like they owed me something. I didn't want gratitude to become a burden. I glanced toward the stage, toward Daniel. I especially didn't want my son to feel like his success belonged to me. The words hung in the air, heavy, honest, and for the first time that night, Daniel looked down. Laura nodded slowly, absorbing that. But it did shape his path, she said. Whether you claimed it or not. I didn't respond immediately. Because she was right. Of course she was right. But acknowledging that truth felt complicated. It gave him a starting point, I admitted. But what he built after that, that's his. There was no bitterness in my voice, only something quieter, acceptance. But the room wasn't done listening. Another voice spoke up this time from somewhere closer to the stage. Mrs. Crawford, a man said, Are you saying your son knew about the trust? I felt the shift immediately, the direction of the conversation, the tension creeping back in. I looked at Daniel again. His face was tight now, controlled, waiting. Yes, I said slowly. He knew. A ripple moved through the audience, and he received support from it, the man pressed. I nodded. In the beginning, I said, when he needed it most. The room grew still again, because now there was no confusion, no ambiguity. The narrative Daniel had presented just moments earlier was unraveling. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. All eyes turned back to the stage, to Daniel. He stood there frozen for a moment, as if calculating his next move. This was his world, his space, his identity. And now, it was slipping. He stepped forward slightly, forcing a small smile. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he said. My mother is incredibly generous, and I respect what she's done. But my success? He stopped. Just briefly. And in that pause, something changed. Because I wasn't looking away anymore. I was looking at him directly. Not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more difficult to face. Truth. And for the first time since he stepped on that stage, he couldn't look past me. The room waited, holding its breath, because whatever came next would define more than just his reputation. It would define who he truly was. And deep down, I think he knew that too. The silence stretched longer than anyone in that room seemed comfortable with. Daniel stood on that stage, the weight of every eye pressing into him, and for the first time in his life, at least the version of his life he had carefully constructed, he didn't have an immediate answer. I could see it, not just in his hesitation, but in the way his shoulders tightened, the way his jaw flexed, as if he were trying to hold something back. For years, he had been in control of every narrative, every interview, every speech, every carefully chosen word. But truth wasn't something you could rehearse. And now it stood in front of him, alive, unavoidable. "I think," he began slowly, his voice measured, but no longer effortless, "that what we're seeing here is a difference in perspective." A few people shifted in their seats. Some nodded, as if they were ready to accept that explanation. But others didn't. "I've always respected my mother," he continued, "and I appreciate what she's done for the community. But I also believe that success is about what you do with the opportunities you're given." "I've always respected my mother," he continued, "and I appreciate what she's done for the community. But I also believe that success is about what you do with the opportunities you're given." There it was. The pivot, the attempt to reclaim control. "And I made choices," he said, his confidence returning just slightly. "I took risks. I worked harder than anyone else. That's what built this company." A small ripple of agreement moved through part of the crowd, but it wasn't the same as before. Something had shifted. Because now people weren't just listening. They were comparing, weighing. Laura stepped forward again, her voice calm but precise. "No one is questioning your effort, Daniel," she said. "But the question is, why minimize the foundation that made those efforts possible?" He exhaled sharply. "I'm not minimizing anything," he replied. "I'm just being honest." I felt something inside me tighten. Honest. That word landed heavier than anything else he had said. Because honesty wasn't just about what you said, it was about what you chose to leave out. Laura didn't look away. "Then let's be completely honest," she said. "Did your mother's trust fund directly support your education and your first business plan?" Daniel's eyes flickered. "Just for a second. Yes," he said finally. The word hung in the air, clear, undeniable. A few people in the room exchanged glances. Some leaned back slightly, as if reassessing everything they had just heard. "But that doesn't define my success," he added quickly. "Plenty of people get help and do nothing with it." His tone had changed. Sharper, defensive, and plenty of people never get help at all, Laura replied quietly. That landed hard, because now the conversation wasn't just about Daniel. It was about something bigger, something the entire room understood. Opportunity, privilege, acknowledgement. Daniel's expression hardened. "I think this is becoming unnecessarily personal," he said. "Tonight is supposed to be about celebrating." "Celebration without truth is just performance." Laura interrupted. The room went still again. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was something else, something raw, something real. And in the middle of it was my son and me. I didn't want it to go this far. I never had. But something inside me knew it already had. Danielle looked out at the crowd, searching for support, for agreement, for anything that would bring the room back under his control. But instead, what he found was uncertainty. Because people weren't sure what to believe anymore. Not fully, not blindly. And that was something he wasn't used to. "I never asked for any of this," he said, suddenly, his voice rising slightly. "I never asked to be put in this position." A murmur spread again, and this time, it wasn't in his favor. Because for the first time, he sounded like someone trying to escape accountability. And I felt it, that subtle shift. The moment when the room stopped seeing him as untouchable and started seeing him as human, flawed, vulnerable. I could have stayed quiet. I had done it before. I had done it my entire life. But something about the way he said those words, "I never asked for any of this," it stayed with me. Because it wasn't true. Not completely. He had asked for success, for recognition, for admiration. And those things came with truth. Whether you wanted it or not. My hands tightened slightly around the microphone. I hadn't planned to speak again, but before I could stop myself, I did. "Daniel," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in that room, it didn't need to be. Everything stopped. He turned toward me slowly, and for a brief moment, he didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a son. "What you built matters," I said. "It really does." His expression softened just slightly, because that was something he understood, something he wanted to hear. "But so does how you tell the story of how you got there," I continued. The softness faded, replaced by tension. "You didn't just figure it out on your own," I said gently. "You had help, and that's not something to be ashamed of." I could feel the room listening again, not to the reporter, not to the controversy, but to something more personal, something deeper. "I never wanted credit," I said. "That's why I stayed quiet. But I also never wanted to disappear from your story." My voice wavered slightly at the end, because that was the truth I had been carrying for years. Not anger, not resentment, just absence. Daniel stared at me, and for a moment I saw something break through. Not defensiveness, not pride, something else, something more fragile. I didn't mean he started, but he stopped. Because I think he realized there wasn't a simple way to finish that sentence, and for the first time that night, he didn't try to. The room remained silent, but it wasn't tense anymore. It was, but he stopped. Because I think he realized there wasn't a simple way to finish that sentence, and for the first time that night, he didn't try to. The room remained silent, but it wasn't tense anymore. It was waiting. Because something important had just been said. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but honestly. And sometimes, that was more powerful than anything else. For a long moment, no one spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion anymore. It was the kind that comes when something real has been said, something that can't be undone or ignored. Daniel stood there still holding the microphone, but his grip had loosened. I could see it in his hands, in his posture, in the way his eyes didn't scan the room anymore, searching for approval. They stayed on me, and I realized something then. This wasn't just difficult for me. It was difficult for him too. Not because he was being exposed, but because he was being seen. Truly seen. Not as the version of himself he had built for the world, but as the son who had slowly rewritten his past. "I didn't mean to erase you," he said finally. His voice was quieter now, less controlled, less polished. The words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded human. A few people in the audience shifted, leaning forward slightly, listening more closely now, because this wasn't a performance anymore. It was something else, something fragile. He continued, hesitating. I didn't want people to think I got here because of connections or handouts. There it was, the fear behind everything. Not pride, not arrogance, fear. I felt my chest tighten, but not in the same way as before. This time it wasn't hurt. It was understanding. I wanted them to respect me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, for what I built. I nodded slowly. I know, I said, and I did. That part had always been clear to me, but knowing it didn't erase what had happened. It's okay to want that, I added gently, but respect built on an incomplete truth doesn't last. The room absorbed that, and I could feel it. The shift wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. Laura didn't interrupt this time. She stayed where she was watching, letting the moment unfold naturally. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. A gesture I hadn't seen him make since he was a teenager. I didn't think it mattered, he said. The details, the beginning, it always matters, I replied softly. Not sharply, not accusingly, just honestly. Because the beginning is where everything starts, I said. And when you change that, you change the meaning of everything that comes after. He looked down at the stage floor, and for a moment, I wondered what he was seeing. Not the polished wood beneath his feet, but maybe the past, the late nights I worked, the times I came home too tired to speak, the moments I hid my exhaustion because I didn't want him to feel it, the checks I wrote quietly, the sacrifices I never explained, not because I didn't want him to know, but because I didn't want him to feel burdened by them. I thought I was protecting myself, he said slowly. And maybe you were, I said. But in doing that, you forgot something important. He looked up again. What? He asked. You forgot that your story isn't just yours, I said. The words hung between us, heavy, but not cruel. It's also mine, I continued. And it's the story of everyone who helped you get here. The room was completely still now. No whispers, no movement, just listening. Because what was happening on that stage wasn't about business anymore. It wasn't about success. It was about something far more personal. Ownership, truth, and the courage to face both. Daniel swallowed. I could see the struggle in his eyes now. Not the kind that comes from being challenged, but the kind that comes from realizing you've been avoiding something for a long time. I didn't know how to talk about it, he admitted. That felt real, more real than anything he had said earlier. You could have started with the truth, I said gently. A small, almost humorless smile touched his lips. Yeah, he said. That would have been easier. Eventually, a few people in the audience let out soft, understanding breaths, because they recognized that feeling. The way avoiding something can seem easier in the moment, until it isn't. Laura stepped forward slightly again, but this time her tone was different. Less investigative, more reflective. Daniel, she said, do you think acknowledging your mother's role would actually take away from your success, or add to it? That question lingered, because it wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at me again, and this time there was no distance in his gaze, no barrier, just honesty. I don't know. It was an invitation. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at me again, and this time there was no distance in his gaze, No barrier, just honesty. "I don't know," he said finally. And for some reason, that answer felt more powerful than anything else he could have said. Because it was the first time that night he wasn't trying to control the outcome. He was just telling the truth. And that was enough. For now. I slowly sat back down, my legs feeling slightly unsteady. The moment had shifted again, not into resolution, not yet, but into something quieter, something more open. The tension that had once filled the room had softened, not disappeared, but changed. People weren't watching a confrontation anymore. They were witnessing a process, a reckoning. And those don't happen all at once. They happen in pieces. Daniel turned slightly, addressing the room again. His voice was steadier now, but different. Less performative. More grounded. I think he began pausing briefly. "I think I have more to learn about how to tell my story honestly." A few nods appeared throughout the audience, not in admiration, but in respect, because admitting that took something he hadn't shown before. Humility. "And I think," he continued, glancing briefly in my direction, "I owe some people an acknowledgement I should have made a long time ago." He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. The room didn't erupt into applause this time. Instead, there was something quieter, more meaningful. Understanding. Because growth doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like this: messy, uncomfortable, incomplete, but real. And as I sat there watching my son, not the CEO, not the public figure, but the person underneath it all, I realized something I hadn't expected. This wasn't the ending of something. It was the beginning of a different kind of truth, one we both had to learn how to live with. The event didn't end right away. No one rushed out. No music started. No polite transition back into celebration. Instead, people lingered, as if everyone in that room understood something important had just happened, and it couldn't simply be wrapped up with applause and small talk. I stayed seated for a few moments, letting my breathing settle. My hands were still slightly trembling, though I wasn't sure if it was from the adrenaline or from everything that had just been said. Maybe both. Around me, conversations slowly began to rise, quiet at first, then gradually louder. Not gossip, not exactly. More like reflection. People trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. And at the center of it all was Daniel. He stepped down from the stage slowly, no longer surrounded by that invisible shield of confidence he used to carry so effortlessly. A few people approached him, colleagues, investors, friends. But the way they spoke to him now was different. Still respectful, but more measured, more thoughtful, as if they were seeing him with new context. And I realized something uncomfortable but true. Reputation isn't just built in moments of success. It's shaped in moments of truth. Laura approached me again this time without the microphone, without the camera hovering just behind her shoulder. "You handled that with a lot of grace," she said quietly. I gave a small, tired smile. "I didn't plan to say any of that," I admitted. She nodded. "Those are usually the moments that matter most." I let out a soft breath. "I never wanted to embarrass him," I said. "I don't think you did," she replied gently. "I think you gave him something he didn't know he needed." I looked at her, unsure. "What's that?" "A chance to tell the truth," she said. Her words stayed with me, because I wasn't sure if Daniel would see it that way. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. The room continued to hum quietly around us. but I found myself scanning the space, looking for him. It didn't take long. He was standing near the far side of the room, speaking to a man in a gray suit. His posture was straighter again, more composed. But there was something different now. A hesitation, a pause between his words, as if he were thinking more carefully about what he said. That alone told me everything I needed to know. He had heard me, whether he agreed or not. He had heard me. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress out of habit more than necessity. For a moment, I considered leaving, slipping out quietly the way I always had, letting the night belong to him again. But my feet didn't move toward the exit. Instead, they moved toward him. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't know what would happen next. Would he be defensive? Distant? Would he avoid me entirely? Or worse, would he try to pretend none of this had happened? I reached the edge of the small group he was speaking with just as their conversation ended. The man in the gray suit nodded politely and walked away. And then, it was just the two of us. For the first time that night. Without an audience. Without a stage. Without a microphone. Just a mother and her son. Daniel looked at me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Up close, I could see it more clearly now. The tension, the exhaustion, the weight of everything he had been holding together for so long. I didn't expect tonight to go like that, he said finally. There was no defensiveness in his tone, just honesty. Neither did I replied. A small, almost awkward silence followed, the kind that comes when there are too many things to say and no clear place to start. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out quickly, but they didn't feel rushed. They felt necessary. "For what I said earlier," he added, "about doing everything on my own." I studied his face, looking for something, a sign that this was just another attempt to manage the situation, to smooth things over. But I didn't find it. Instead, I found something else, something simpler. Regret. "You don't have to apologize for wanting to feel proud of what you built," I said. His brow furrowed slightly. "That's not what I'm apologizing for," he said. I waited. "I'm apologizing for acting like you weren't part of it," he continued. That was different. That mattered. I felt something inside me soften. Not completely. Not all at once. But enough. "I never needed credit," I said quietly. "I know," he replied. "And maybe that made it easier for me to pretend it didn't matter." His honesty caught me off guard. Because he wasn't just acknowledging what happened. He was trying to understand why. "I thought if I kept my story clean, simple, people would respect it more," he said. "And now?" I asked. He let out a slow breath. "Now I think I made it smaller." The words landed deeper than he probably realized, because that was exactly what had happened, not just to me, but to him, to his story, to everything he had worked for. Truth doesn't weaken a story. It gives it weight. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted. I smiled softly. "You don't fix it all at once," I said. "You just start telling it differently." He nodded slowly, absorbing that, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was talking to someone who needed to defend himself. It felt like I was talking to someone who was willing to learn. "I should have said your name," he said quietly. I looked at him. "You still can," I replied. He met my gaze, and there was something steady there now, something grounded. "I will," he said. A pause. And then, "Not just here," he added. "Everywhere." I didn't respond right away because I understood what that meant. It wasn't just about this event. It was about everything that came after. Every interview, every speech, every story he told about himself. And for the first time that night, I believed him. Not because his words were perfect, but because they weren't. They were uncertain, incomplete, real. And that was enough. For now. The drive home that night felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, but because my mind refused to quiet down. Every word, every expression, every moment on that stage replayed itself over and over again. I sat in the passenger seat of the car Daniel had insisted on sending for me, watching the city lights blur past the window. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to finally be acknowledged by my son. To hear him say my name. To see him recognize everything that had gone into his success. But I hadn't imagined it like this. Not in front of a room full of strangers. Not through tension and confrontation. Not with a reporter pulling truth into the open. And yet, part of me wondered if there had ever been another way. Because silence had been my choice. For so long. When I finally arrived home, the house felt exactly as it always had. Quiet. Still. Safe. But something inside me had shifted. I didn't feel invisible anymore. And that realization, it was both comforting and unsettling. I changed into something more comfortable and sat at the kitchen table resting my hands around a cup of tea I hadn't even tasted yet. The clock ticked softly on the wall, steady, unbothered, as if time itself didn't care that everything in my life had just been turned inside out. I thought about Daniel, about the look in his eyes when he said he would tell the story differently. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But belief takes time to rebuild, especially when it has been quietly worn down over years. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had anywhere to be, but because sleep had come in fragments. Short, restless pieces. I made coffee, letting the familiar routine ground me. The simple act of pouring, stirring, breathing in the warmth. It helped. A little. By mid-morning, my phone started ringing. At first, I ignored it. Then it rang again, and again. Different numbers, unknown callers. Finally, I picked it up. "Hello, is this Helen Crawford?" The voice was polite, professional. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "This is Karen Mitchell from Channel 8 News. We'd like to ask you a few questions about last night's event." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Of course, the story hadn't ended in that room. It had only begun. "I'm not sure I have anything more to add," I said carefully. "I understand," she replied. "But the segment aired this morning, and there's been a significant response." That made me pause. What kind of response, I asked. "A lot of people are sharing your story," she said. "And your work, your foundation. Many of them had no idea about your humanitarian efforts." My grip tightened slightly on the phone. "They weren't meant to," I said. "I think that's part of why people are reacting so strongly," she said gently. "They're inspired." Inspired. That word felt strange, unfamiliar. I had never done any of it for recognition, never expected it, but now it was here, whether I wanted it or not. "I'd prefer to keep things private," I said finally. "I understand," she replied again. If you change your mind, we'd be honored to speak with you. When I hung up, I sat there for a moment, staring at nothing. Then slowly I reached for the remote, turned on the television, and there it was. The segment. Laura's voice filled the room, calm and steady as always. What began as a routine awards ceremony quickly turned into something far more revealing. Clips from the night played on the screen. Daniel speaking, me listening. The moment everything shifted. And then they showed footage I hadn't expected. Photos, videos, records of my work. The shelters, the food programs, the scholarship funds. Faces of people I had helped over the years. Smiling, grateful, alive in ways they hadn't been before. My chest tightened because I had never seen it all put together like that, never viewed my life's work as a story. To me, it had just been the right thing to do. Helen Crawford has spent over 3 decades quietly supporting communities across the state. Laura's voice continued. Choosing impact over recognition. The words settled into the room, into me, and for the first time, I saw it the way others might. Not as small, quiet acts, but as something larger, something meaningful, something real. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Daniel. I stared at his name on the screen for a long moment before opening it. I saw the segment. Can we talk? Simple, direct. No excuses, no explanations, just a request. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I watched the rest of the segment, listened to every word, every detail, every piece of a life I had never thought anyone would care to understand. When it ended, the room fell silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt different, full. I picked up my phone again, read his message one more time, and then I typed back, "Come by this afternoon." A few seconds later, 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "Thank you." I set the phone down gently, and for the first time since the night before, I felt something settle inside me. Not closure, not resolution, but something close. A beginning of something new, something honest, something we had both been avoiding for far too long. And now, there was no avoiding it anymore. Daniel arrived earlier than I expected. I heard his car pull into the driveway just as I was finishing drying the dishes. For a moment, I stood still at the sink, my hands resting on the edge, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. It was strange. I had faced rooms full of strangers, handled difficult conversations, carried burdens for decades without breaking. And yet, the thought of sitting across from my own son having an honest conversation made me nervous. I wiped my hands slowly, giving myself a moment to breathe. Then I walked to the door and opened it before he had a chance to knock. He was standing there, one hand half raised, as if caught in the middle of deciding whether to ring the bell. For a brief second, we just looked at each other. No stage, no audience, just daylight and truth. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I replied. I stepped aside, letting him in. The house seemed to notice him. That's the only way I can describe it. The air shifted slightly, as if it had been waiting for this moment too. He walked in slowly, looking around, not as if he had never been there before, but as if he was seeing it differently, more carefully, more thoughtfully. "Everything looks the same," he said quietly. I gave a small smile. "It usually does," I replied. But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. We moved into the living room, and I gestured for him to sit. He did, but not with his usual confidence. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. A posture I hadn't seen since he was much younger. When he needed guidance, when he didn't have all the answers. I sat across from him, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. It was necessary. "I watched the segment," he said finally. I nodded. So did I. He let out a slow breath. They showed everything he said. "Yes, I didn't know he started, then stopped. I waited." He shook his head slightly, searching for the right words. "I didn't know how much you had done," he admitted. The honesty in his voice landed heavily between us. Not because it surprised me, but because hearing it said out loud made it real. "You weren't supposed to," I said gently. He looked up at me. "Why not?" I considered the question for a moment, because it deserved more than a simple answer. "Because it wasn't about being seen," I said. "It was about doing what needed to be done." He frowned slightly. "But don't you think people should know?" he asked. I smiled softly. "That depends on why they want to know." He leaned back a little, absorbing that. "I think I understand that now," he said. I studied him carefully. There was something different in his tone. Less certainty, more curiosity. That segment he continued, it made me realize something. I didn't interrupt. "I've been telling my story like it started with me," he said. "Like everything before that didn't matter." I nodded slightly. "That's what it sounded like," I said. He winced just a little. Not from anger, from recognition. "I didn't think I was doing that," he admitted, "but I was." "Yes," I said. There was no need to soften it, not now, not when he was finally willing to see it. He exhaled slowly, running his hands together as if trying to steady himself. I kept thinking, if I talked about my struggles, my hard work, people would respect me more. He said, "And they might," I replied. "But respect built on only part of the truth is fragile." He nodded again. "I see that now." Another pause settled between us, but this one felt lighter, less heavy, like something was beginning to loosen. "There's something else," he said. His voice was quieter now, more careful. I felt my chest tighten slightly. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I felt it. There was more here than just regret about what he had said. More than just acknowledgement, something deeper, something harder. "I think," he started slowly, "I think I've been angry at you." That caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't sensed distance between us, but because I hadn't expected him to name it. "Angry," I repeated. He nodded. "I didn't understand why you were always gone when I was younger," he said. "Why you worked so much. Why everything felt stretched thin." I listened carefully, not interrupting, not defending. "I know now it was because you were helping people," he continued. "But back then, it just felt like I wasn't enough of a reason for you to stay." The words hit deeper than anything that had been said the night before. Because this was the truth underneath everything, the part neither of us had ever fully spoken. "I never wanted you to feel that way," I said softly. "I know," he replied quickly. "I know that now. But feelings don't always follow logic," he added. That was true. Pain rarely does. I think part of me, he continued, wanted to prove I could do everything on my own. That I didn't need anyone. I leaned back slightly, letting his words settle. And to do that, I said slowly, "You had to rewrite the past." He met my eyes. Yes, no hesitation, no excuses, just truth. "And I didn't realize how much that would erase you," he added. The room felt very still, very quiet, but not in a suffocating way, in a revealing way, like everything hidden was finally being brought into the light. I never needed to be everything to you, I said gently, but I didn't expect to be nothing either. His expression softened. I know, he said again, and this time it sounded different, more grounded, more real. I don't want that anymore, he added. I don't want to keep pretending. I nodded slowly. Then don't, I said. It sounded simple, but we both knew it wasn't. Truth takes practice, especially after years of avoiding it. I want to do this right, he said. Not just for me, for you too. I studied him for a long moment, looking for doubt, for hesitation. But what I saw instead was effort. And sometimes that's where healing begins. Well, figure it out, I said. Not a promise, not a guarantee, but a start. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like we were finally on the same side of the story. After Daniel left that afternoon, the house felt different. Not empty, not quiet in the way it used to be, but reflective. Like the walls themselves had heard everything we said and were still holding on to it. I sat in the same chair for a long time after the door closed behind him, not moving, not thinking in any structured way, just feeling. There was relief. That was the first thing I noticed. A kind of quiet relief I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. But because something had finally been acknowledged, spoken out loud, seen, and that changes things. More than most people realize. But alongside that relief, there was something else too. A question. One I hadn't fully faced until now. What happens next? Because healing isn't a single conversation. It's not one apology. It's not even one moment of truth. It's a process. And processes require choices, consistent ones. Later that evening, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a reporter. It was someone I hadn't heard from in years. Mrs. Crawford. The voice was hesitant, familiar in a distant way. Yes, this is Helen, I replied. This is Angela Brooks. I paused, and then it clicked. Angela, a young woman I had helped nearly 15 years ago. She had been barely out of her teens trying to raise her younger siblings after their mother passed. Struggling, lost, but determined. Angela. I said, a small smile forming without me realizing it. It's been a long time. I saw you on the news, she said, her voice catching slightly. I had to call. I leaned back slightly, holding the phone a little closer. How are you? I asked. I'm good, she said. Really good. I'm a nurse now. My brother just finished college. My sister's starting her own business. Her voice was filled with pride, with life, and I felt something warm settle in my chest. That's wonderful, I said sincerely. We wouldn't be here without you, she added. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. That sentence. It always landed deeper than people realized. You did the hard part, I said gently. I just helped where I could. No, she replied firmly. You gave us a chance, and that's everything. We spoke for a few more minutes. She shared updates, memories, moments I had almost forgotten. And when we finally hung up, I sat there quietly holding the phone in my hand. Because that call, it reminded me of something important, something I had almost lost sight of in all the noise. This wasn't about recognition. It never had been. It was about impact, real, human, lasting. But now, that impact was visible, public, and I couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. The next few days unfolded in ways I hadn't expected. More calls, more messages, people reaching out. Some I knew, many I didn't. Stories being shared, connections being made, and slowly, my quiet life began to feel less quiet. At first, it overwhelmed me. I won't pretend it didn't. I had spent decades working in the background, avoiding attention, choosing privacy. And now suddenly I was being asked to step forward, to speak, to explain, to represent something larger than myself. It wasn't comfortable, but it also wasn't wrong. And that distinction mattered. One afternoon, I received another message from Daniel. "Would you be open to doing an interview with me?" I read it twice. Then a third time, because I wanted to be sure I understood what he was asking. Not an interview about him, not a statement to fix his image, but with him, together. That was new. That was different. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sat with the question. Let it settle. Because this wasn't just about appearances, it was about intention. Later that evening, he called. "I didn't want to put you on the spot," he said. "I just thought it might be a chance to tell the story the right way." I leaned against the kitchen counter, considering his words. "And what does the right way look like to you?" I asked. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Honest," he said. "Complete, not just the parts that make me look good." I nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see me. "And are you ready for that?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "I think so," he said. "Not certainty, but willingness. And sometimes that's where truth begins." "We can talk about it," I replied. That seemed to ease something in him. "Okay," he said. "That's all I'm asking." After the call ended, I stood there for a while, thinking, because this was the next step. Not just between us, but in how our story would exist in the world. And I realized something important. For years, I had chosen silence. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I believed the work mattered more than the recognition. And I still believed that. But now, silence had a different cost. It allowed others to shape the narrative, to simplify it, to leave out the parts that were harder, messier, more human. And maybe it was time to speak. Not for attention, not for validation, but for truth. A few days later, Daniel came by again. This time, we didn't sit across from each other like strangers trying to find common ground. We sat side by side at the kitchen table, looking at notes, ideas, questions. "What do you want people to understand?" he asked me. I thought about that, really thought about it. "Not what they see on the surface," I said slowly, "but what it takes underneath." He nodded, writing something down. "And you?" I asked. He hesitated, then looked at me. "I want them to understand that I didn't get here alone," he said. Simple, but meaningful. We spent hours talking, not just about what we would say, but about what we had never said before. Stories from his childhood, moments I had forgotten, moments he had misunderstood. And slowly, piece by piece, we began to rebuild something. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, and for the first time in a very long time. That felt like enough. The day of the interview arrived faster than I expected. Even though Daniel and I had spent hours preparing, talking, adjusting, and revisiting what we wanted to say, there was still something unpredictable about it. Because truth once spoken publicly takes on a life of its own. And there was no controlling how people would receive it. The studio was smaller than I imagined. Warm lights, soft, neutral colors, a quiet hum of activity behind the scenes. It wasn't like the large, intimidating stages I had seen on television. But that didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it more real, more intimate, more exposed. Daniel stood beside me as we waited to go on. Not as a public figure, not as a businessman, just as my son. He glanced at me, offering a small, uncertain smile. "You okay?" he asked. I considered the question, then nodded. "I will be." He let out a breath, almost like he'd been holding it in. "Me too," he admitted. That honesty, it mattered. More than rehearsed confidence ever could. Across the room, Laura Bennett was reviewing her notes. When she looked up and saw us, she smiled, calm, composed, reassuring. Not intrusive, not aggressive, just present. "Thank you both for doing this," she said as she approached. "This isn't easy." "No," I replied. "But it feels necessary." She nodded. That's usually when the most important conversations happen. A few minutes later, we were seated, side by side. The cameras adjusted. The lights softened slightly. And then, we began. Laura started simply. "No scripts today," she said gently. "Just a conversation." I appreciated that, because anything else would have felt dishonest. She turned to Daniel first. "Last week at the awards ceremony, something unexpected happened," she said. "How did that moment change your perspective?" Daniel didn't rush to answer. He took a breath, looked down briefly, then back up. "It forced me to confront something I didn't even realize I had been avoiding," he said. "The truth." Laura nodded. "And what truth was that?" He glanced at me, just for a second, then answered. "That my story wasn't just mine," he said. "And by telling it like it was, I was leaving out the person who made it possible." The room felt very still, very quiet. Laura didn't interrupt. She let his words settle. "And that person is your mother," she said. "Yes," he replied. No hesitation, no discomfort, just clarity. She turned to me. "Helen, you spent decades doing humanitarian work quietly," she said. "Why did you choose to stay out of the spotlight?" I folded my hands gently in my lap. Because the answer wasn't complicated, but it was personal. Because the work was never about me, I said. It was about the people who needed it. She studied me for a moment. "But now that your story is public, do you feel differently?" she asked. I paused. Because this question, it mattered. "Yes," I said slowly, "but not in the way people might expect." She leaned in slightly. "How so?" "I don't feel a need to be recognized," I said, "but I do see the value in being understood." That seemed to resonate. Not just with her, but with everyone in the room. "And understanding requires visibility," she said. "Sometimes," I replied. "Yes." She turned back to Daniel. "There's been a lot of discussion about your speech," she said. "What would you say now if you could stand on that stage again?" Daniel didn't hesitate this time. "I would tell the whole story," he said. Laura raised an eyebrow slightly. "What does that look like?" He turned toward me fully now. "Not just as a gesture, but as a statement. It looks like acknowledging that my success didn't start with me," he said. "That it started with sacrifice." with choices that weren't always easy, with a mother who gave more than I understood at the time. His voice wasn't perfect. It wavered slightly, but that made it real. And for the first time, I saw not just my son, but the man he was becoming. Laura let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. Helen, hearing that, what does it mean to you? I took a breath, letting the emotions settle before answering. It means he's ready to see things clearly, I said. And that's all I've ever wanted. Not praise, not validation, just understanding. The conversation continued. Not as an interview, but as something closer to a shared reflection. We spoke about the past, about misunderstandings, about the quiet distance that had grown between us over the years. And for the first time, we didn't avoid the difficult parts. Laura asked questions others might have been afraid to ask. Do you regret anything, she asked me at one point? I didn't answer right away. Because regret is complicated. I regret that there were moments my son felt alone, I said. Even when I believed I was doing what was right. Daniel looked down at that, not in shame, but in recognition. And you, she asked him. He exhaled slowly. I regret that I turned that feeling into something else, he said, into distance, into resentment, instead of trying to understand. And you, she asked him. He exhaled slowly. I regret that I turned that feeling into something else, he said, into distance, into resentment, instead of trying to understand. Laura nodded. Do you think that's common? She asked. Yes, Daniel said. I think a lot of people rewrite their past to make sense of their present, and sometimes that means leaving out the parts that don't fit the narrative they want. I glanced at him. Because that was insight, real insight. And now, she asked. Now I want the full picture, he said. The interview ended more quietly than it began. No dramatic conclusion, no grand statement, just a sense of completion, not of the story, but of this chapter. As we stepped off the set, Daniel turned to me. How did I do? He asked. I smiled. Honestly, I said. He nodded. You did better than I expected, I replied. He laughed softly. He'll take that. We walked out together. Not perfectly healed, not suddenly transformed, but different, stronger, in a quieter way. And as we stepped into the daylight, I realized something. This wasn't about being exposed anymore. It was about being seen, fully, honestly, and finally, together. The interview aired 3 days later. I hadn't planned to watch it live. In fact, part of me wanted to avoid it entirely. Not out of fear, but out of a quiet instinct I had always followed. Do the work. Then step back. But this time, stepping back didn't feel right. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even just about Daniel. It was about something larger. A story that had already begun to reach people far beyond our small private world. So that evening, I sat in my living room, the same place I had spent countless quiet nights, and turned on the television. The opening was simple. No dramatic music, no exaggerated build-up. Just Laura's voice, steady and clear. Sometimes the stories we tell about success leave out the parts that matter most. The screen shifted. Clips from the gala. The moment Daniel spoke. The moment everything changed. And then the interview. Us, side by side, telling the truth. I watched myself carefully. Not critically, just curiously. It's strange seeing your own life from the outside. Hearing your own words through someone else's lens. For years, my life had felt small, not in a negative way, but in a quiet, contained way. Now, it didn't look small at all. It looked meaningful. The segment moved smoothly between past and present, between who we were and who we were becoming. They showed more footage of the community work, people I had helped, stories I hadn't thought about in years. Angela was there, smiling, confident, telling her story. She didn't just help us survive, Angela said on screen. She helped us believe we could have a future. My eyes softened at that. Because belief, that's something you can't measure, but it changes everything. Then the focus shifted back to Daniel. Not the version of him from the gala, but the version from the interview. More grounded, more reflective. I thought telling my story as self-made made it stronger, he said on screen. But I realize now it made it incomplete. The honesty in his voice was unmistakable. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pride. Not in his success. I had always felt that, but in his willingness to grow, to change, to face something uncomfortable and not turn away from it. That kind of strength. It's different. It's quieter. But it lasts longer. When the segment ended, the room fell silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt full, complete. I reached for the remote and turned off the television, letting the quiet settle naturally around me. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Did you watch it?" I smiled slightly and typed back, "Yes." A moment later, I meant what I said. I didn't need clarification. I knew exactly which part he was referring to. "I know," I replied. There was a pause. Then, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I stared at the message for a long moment. Because those words, they carried weight. More than anything he had said on stage. More than anything he had said in the interview. Because they were personal, unfiltered, real. I typed slowly. "I never did." The response came quickly this time. "I know that now." I set the phone down gently, letting the conversation rest there, because not everything needed to be said all at once. Some things grow better in quiet. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. The attention didn't fade. It shifted. It became something else. Organizations reached out, not for interviews, but for collaboration. People wanted to support the work, expand it, build on it. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I had never seriously thought about before. What if this visibility could be useful? Not for me, but for the people I had always worked for, the ones who still needed help, the ones still waiting for a chance. One afternoon, Daniel came by again. But this time, there was something different about him. Not just in how he spoke, but in how he listened. "I've been thinking," he said as we sat at the kitchen table. "That's a good sign," I replied lightly. He smiled. "I want to do more than just tell the story differently," listened. "I've been thinking," he said as we sat at the kitchen table. "That's a good sign," I replied lightly. He smiled. "I want to do more than just tell the story differently," he said. "I want to be part of what you've been building." I studied him carefully, because those words, they mattered. "How?" I asked. "I have resources," he said. "Connections, reach, things you never wanted to use before." "That's true," I said. "But maybe now they can serve something bigger," he added. I didn't answer right away, because this wasn't a simple decision. It wasn't about scale or growth. It was about intention. "Why do you want to do this?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "Because I finally understand what it means," he said, "and I don't want to stand outside of it anymore." That answer, it felt right. Not perfect, but sincere. And sincerity matters more than perfection ever will. "We'll take it one step at a time," I said. He nodded. Together, he asked. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, there was no distance, no hesitation, no unspoken barrier between us. "Together," I said. And in that moment, I realized something. This story had never been about humiliation, or exposure, or even recognition. It had been about something far more important: understanding, and the courage to face it. Not just once, but again and again, until it becomes part of who you are. It's strange how life doesn't end with a single moment, not with the humiliation, not with the exposure, not even with the truth. It continues, quietly, steadily, asking you again and again what kind of person you choose to be next. A few months passed after the interview aired, and during that time, something remarkable happened. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently. The work grew, not because I pushed it to, but because people believed in it. Daniel kept his word. That mattered more than anything. He didn't just appear for interviews or speak about change. He showed up. In ways I hadn't seen before. He attended community meetings, not as a speaker, but as a listener. He sat in rooms where no one cared about his success, only about the problems they were facing. And instead of trying to fix everything with money or influence, he learned. One afternoon, I watched him from across the room at a small community center. He was sitting beside a young man, maybe 20 years old, listening intently as the boy spoke about struggling to support his family. Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't offer immediate solutions. He just listened. And I realized this wasn't temporary. This wasn't guilt. This was growth. Later that evening, we walked out together. "You didn't say much in there," I noted. He smiled slightly. "I didn't need to. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't guilt. This was growth." Later that evening, we walked out together. "You didn't say much in there," I noted. He smiled slightly. "I didn't need to," he said. "I think I've said enough for a while." I nodded. "That's usually when people start hearing you," I replied. He looked at me, understanding exactly what I meant. Our relationship didn't transform overnight. It didn't become perfect. There were still moments of hesitation, still small misunderstandings, still habits we both had to unlearn. But the difference was, we didn't avoid them anymore. We faced them, together. And that changes everything. One day, Daniel approached me with an idea. "I want to create a foundation," he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Not just in my name," he added quickly. "In ours." I leaned back in my chair, considering him carefully. "And what would this foundation do?" I asked. He didn't rush his answer. "It would support the kind of work you've been doing all along," he said, "but on a larger scale. Education, housing, community programs, things that give people real opportunities." I studied his face, looking for something. Not perfection, not certainty, just intention. "And why now?" I asked. He met my gaze directly. "Because I understand now what happens when people are given a chance," he said, "and I want to be part of creating that for others." I didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't just a project, it was a responsibility. But I could see it in him. The shift, the sincerity, the willingness to do the work, not just be associated with it. "We'll build it carefully," I said. "The right way. He smiled. That's the only way I want to do it. And so we began. Not with grand announcements, not with press releases, but with planning, with listening, with understanding what was actually needed. And over time, the foundation took shape. It carried both of our names, but more importantly, it carried a shared purpose. Something that didn't exist before. Something we built together. One afternoon, months later, we held a small event at the same community center. Nothing extravagant. Just a gathering of people who had been part of the journey. Angela was there, along with others whose lives had intersected with mine in ways I had almost forgotten. As I stood near the back of the room, watching Daniel speak not as a businessman, but as someone who understood the weight of what he was saying, I felt something settle deeply within me. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing things are right. After the event, Daniel walked over to me. "You should have been the one up there," he said. I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "This isn't about who stands on the stage." He smiled. "I know," he said. "You've been teaching me that." I reached out and placed my hand lightly on his arm. "And you've been learning," I said. We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. The kind that doesn't need to be filled. The kind that only exists when something real has been rebuilt. Later that night, as I sat alone in my living room once again, I thought back to that moment at the gala. The humiliation, the silence, the weight of being unseen. And I realized something. That moment, it didn't break me. It revealed something, not just about my son, but about all of us. How easy it is to misunderstand. How easy it is to overlook the quiet sacrifices. How easy it is to believe incomplete stories. But also, how powerful it is to face the truth, to acknowledge it, to grow from it, and to choose something better. If you had told me then on that stage in that moment that this is where we would end up, I wouldn't have believed you. But life doesn't move in straight lines. It moves through moments, through choices, through the courage to change when it matters most. And sometimes, it takes being humiliated to finally be seen. Not by the world, but by the people who matter most. And in the end, that's what stays. That's what heals. That's what lasts. After everything Helen went through, her story reminds us of something deeply important. Sometimes the people who seem quiet, ordinary, or overlooked are carrying the greatest impact behind the scenes. True strength doesn't always demand recognition. It shows itself in consistency, sacrifice, and compassion over time. But her story also teaches another truth: love within a family is not always perfect. Misunderstandings happen. Pride gets in the way. Pain builds in silence. And sometimes it takes a breaking moment, a public failure, a painful truth, for real healing to begin. Daniel's journey shows us that success without gratitude is incomplete. But growth is always possible. No matter how far we drift, we can choose to come back to listen, to understand, and to rebuild what we once took for granted. And Helen's quiet resilience reminds us you don't need to prove your worth to the world. The right people will see it eventually, and when they do, it can change everything. So I want to ask you, have you ever felt overlooked or misunderstood by someone you love? Do you think people can truly change after they realize their mistakes? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories matter more than you know. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful stories like this. And wherever you're watching from, tell me your city and what time it is there. I'd love to know. You're not alone.